simplification at the bottom of the pyramid and also bring large numbers into the school system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rao. And maybe before I talk about the Schoolnet, I think in the context of today's summit, we are talking about India-Africa Entrepreneurship Network. What is that we could do jointly between India and Africa? That is the primary theme around which this particular panel is supposed to be looking at innovation and various stakeholders. So if you look at three key stakeholders, the government, and we know government should act as an enabler, capital as a catalyst, blended finance because you know the capital is scarce, particularly when I'm talking about India, Africa, and we need to have access to finance, and which is more of blended patient capital, and the networks. These are the three keywords of this panel of the enabler, government, capital, networks as accelerators and ecosystem. We put these three. Do we have a working plan? You know, the problems are known, solutions are known, but how do we convert this into action-oriented is the important. Having spent 15, 16 years within the government, now outside the government, and maybe we need to get into some actionable plan. If so, what is that? What are those elements of that kind of plan that we need to look at? Obviously, we are talking about low-cost, high-tech, and high-impact kind of solution. That's where the sweet spot lies between India and Africa. And the relationship should not be client and service provider. And how do we co-create, which are largely African-owned, African-driven, but strategically supported, enabled by Indian entrepreneurship for all the reasons that since morning we have been doing it. But how do we create such a kind of framework? In my view, I think the biggest challenge, need for both, where the mutual strengths, synergy exists, is around how do we create more incomes, additional incomes, new income generating opportunities so that millions of young people who enter the job market both within and Africa get decent jobs and their incomes get increased. For that we need to do what? We need to educate our kids, we need to skill them, and they need to be healthy. So education, skill development and health. Once you ensure these three and any possible opportunity can be leveraged. But how do you actually go around and do that? Is example, since you talked about what we do, Schoolnet. Schoolnet is India's largest school EduTech provider. We go to the schools, work with the school systems, with the teachers, we provide a device, very beautiful patented device called KR, all-in-one, converts the smart ball into a smart board. You don't require any other device, preloaded with the K-12 content. We train the teacher in using that to teach difficult to learn topics, and there is an impact assessment, and if it is used well over a period of 3 years, significant level of improvement. We are now wanting to work in Africa. Nigeria already about 1,000 schools use. Kenya would like to do it. How do we co-create this particular solution? Why should we create content for Kenya separately? There is no need. You know, we can work with the local entrepreneurs, large number of them. We can co-create a solution for Africa, for Kenya. Africa is continent. For Kenya, based on the curriculum framework of Kenya, there can be a partnership, the local entrepreneurs providing the content and Schoolnet bringing in the entire technology and framework. Similarly, yesterday we had a meeting with the Principal Secretary of TVET here, Vocational Education Training, and they would like to take the technology to the vocational skills institutes. So how do we again create? In India, we have trained and placed 2.5 million young people at the blue collar jobs. We have that expertise and competency, but we don't have the local knowledge in terms of content, qualification framework. Can we again collaborate with the local young startups and learn it? That's how I think we can create an enabling and co-created, which means essentially my just call for action is that from this forum, can we look at sector-specific approach? Each sector requires different way of treatment, all right? Maybe India-Africa knowledge in the network, under that EduTech and skills. Can we look at one particular network around that, get the people? Like these 2-3 themes we pick up, identify both sides, create solutions that can be designed, executed, bring in government as enabler, and finance as sort of blended finance and patient capital, then the ecosystem created. I think that's the way forward. That is how I see from summit to summit. This can also progress, which will be beneficial, mutually win-win situation. Thank you.
In the context of the UPI revolution and all that has been achieved in India's payments business. So again, we had great compulsions to go down the track we took in India. But I want to see how do you think innovation was fostered there, and from the standpoint of your own journey through this company, would you be able to tell us about it?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Rao. Well, I mean, if we look at it from an African payments perspective, we are present in 11 countries today, and we're seeing great innovation happening in Africa. And when we think of the UPI story, which is a mega success, right? The initial thought of UPI also had an M-Pesa imprint in mind. Look what's happening with M-Pesa in Kenya, right? And how can this expand to the country of India. Whether it was through private sector or public sector, but today if you look at UPI, the Honorable High Commissioner mentioned, the size of transactions, the size and the impact that it has. What Visa did in 55 years, UPI has done in 9 years, right? 18 billion transactions happening on a monthly basis on an average, right? $300 billion worth of transactions happening on a monthly basis. 340 million merchants, that are using UPI, that are able to transact on an instant basis, right? So the impact is massive, and we are seeing this in different pockets of Africa as well. We know that Kenya is working on an interoperable instant payment switch. South Africa is working on PayShap. Mauritius is working on MOCAS. Nigeria has implemented NIPS. And now there's the Pan-African payment infrastructure that's happening, right? So which means that if you're running a business in one African country, you're able to make it a regional business because of the payment networks that exist on the continent, right? So that is, and these are most of these initiatives. In fact, all of these initiatives are government-led initiatives where private sector is benefiting in a big way, right? Now we have, benefited from most of these instant payment switches. Greatly, in each country that we operate, we are able to empower the merchants and the consumer to pay on an instant basis, and for the merchant to be settled on an instant basis, solving most of their cash flow issues, right? So definitely, this infrastructure is great. In fact, this forum started in 2019. 2 years ago in Mauritius, we happened to meet the National Payment Corporation of India, the team from National Payments Corporation of India. That's where we did sow the seed. And today, last year at the Global FinTech Fest, we partnered with National Payments Corporation of India, the international arm called NIPL, and we'll be introducing UPI into the South African market, right? And that's the first step, and of connecting, there is, Mauritius, it's active. Prime Minister Modi announced that in Namibia, it is active. And, as more and more countries start to accept UPI payments, India and Africa will further come closer.
Now, we celebrate these great successes in India, but usually there is behind that a enormous compulsion to achieve an outcome. Leakages in our public payment system. So when pensions are distributed to large numbers of government employees, retired, army officers, all sorts of people, in direct subsidy programs that we have undertaken, everywhere there are leakages. So people are compelled, hard-driven. Necessity is the mother of innovation and desperation is the father, they say. This seems to be the case. That's how hero-driven. Schoolnet is another case in point. So when we say that we have large numbers, that we need to lift by the bootstrap into the middle classes. So education is essential to that transition. How do you create in Afrilabs environments in which that kind of innovation is fostered? How do you create deep empathy for people who are looking in different directions, but who should come together and work together and in humility listen to the other person's problems and create new answers? That's the question.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, this is a very interesting question. Of course, I'll speak on the perspective from the perspective of Afrilabs. So as Afrilabs, over the past 13 years, we've been 14 years, we've been very instrumental in building a network across Africa of innovation hubs primarily, so incubators, accelerators, and the spaces that are basically supporting young innovators, entrepreneurs build their solutions from the very idea stage up to scale. But then what's very important about our model is that we take a multi-stakeholder approach, right? Because we believe it's important, right? Innovators cannot thrive or build or scale in a vacuum, right? They need the government support. We've spoken about policy, and that support infrastructure and debt. They need investors, to invest, in the business, especially early stage investors, at a stage where the banks would typically not invest in a startup because they don't have the collateral and, all the requirements of a traditional banking system. And then, of course, we have the development partners, academia, corporates, and other stakeholders as well. Now, to your question around bringing people together, to find out common interests and put, personal agenda aside, differences and all that, and work together. I would say it's key to find a common ground, right, on what we're looking to achieve, right? And this can be quite difficult, especially when you're working in a multicultural context. We talk about Africa as a whole, but we're talking about Africa in thousands of different ethnic groups, for example. We at Afrilabs operate across 53 African countries, that's the entire continent basically, and over 200 African cities, and even within countries, a single country, you would see differences in terms of culture, in terms of ways of doing business and all that. So the question now is, in each endeavor that we go into, I like the previous speaker when he spoke about taking a sector-specific approach. I think that's quite important. For example, a particular program we're running right now is called Emerge, and it's basically focused on identifying innovative solutions and technologies in the clean and renewable energy sector, and what we're doing is that we're building a community around energy experts, energy innovators, energy academia, but then when you look at the core of what we're looking to solve, these are common challenges that exist across the continent. Over 600 million people have lack of access to clean and affordable energy. And these have implications around healthcare, around education, around running sustainable, strong businesses, and all of that, the health implications and all of that. So with that as a common theme, building together a multi-stakeholder approach across Africa with similar challenges and a common goal to bring clean energy to their communities, we're able to foster that community that work together. Bringing in the capital, drawing in the government and the policies, And then most importantly, which is the power of networks, is I'll say three things, right? Is one, a speed to market, so for example, as part of this program, for example, there's a lot of knowledge sharing, When you find an innovation or technology that works in one region, we're thinking how can we scale to another region, so there's that knowledge sharing. Another speed to impact, again, impact is part of scaling solutions that work. And that's what I would like to see, coming out of convenings like this, solutions that work in India and has driven immense impact, millions of people. How can we increase speed to impact? And then, scale in terms of returns. If you're an investor and you're investing in a startup that has access to a Pan-African market or has access to multiple regions, for example, as it is in this room, and you invest in that startup and you have the support infrastructure, through innovation hubs and, mentors and the governments, and they scale to markets, and that investor is going to get multiple returns. The government is going to get multiple returns, and other stakeholders that have invested in that startup.
We sometimes tend to underestimate how exceptionally important political commitment and bureaucratic support is to deep change. And we achieved, everything we celebrated in the last few years as amongst the most innovative changes in India had deep political support and bureaucratic support. And then the institutions aligned, the partners came along, the legislation changed, and financing came along. Everything changed in that context. And left alone, We invested more money in hyper-logistics than AI, as a case in point. So we have food delivery which takes 2 minutes, we have groceries which arrive in 4 minutes, and we challenge ourselves on it. We pour money into warehousing and logistics, like there's nothing to do. So I think that freewheeling leadership, when institutions on their own come together versus when they come together when driven by governments, there is a huge difference which we see in our experience in India. So I wanted to know, how is it that in the investment agency, that the innovation agency that you head, where and how does the government play a significant role in this?
Thanks very much. Tonny is my name, heading the Kenya National Innovation Agency, with a mandate of strengthening the national Kenya innovation ecosystem, with the aspiration of creating more jobs as well. This is a semi-autonomous government issue, so there's an element of government and non-government in there. I sometimes I think about what does it take to succeed. First of all, you need a strong government leadership that is consistent and steady. And that has led me to a realization that because in our political ecosystems, things change. 5 years or 4 years, things change and the priority shift a little bit. And then you have to kind of expose different kinds of people who are policymakers on what it takes to actually drive a strong national system of innovation. And I wouldn't say we've always had success. Sometimes you make 2 steps forward, sometimes legislation is just like that. I mean, it's democratic. You give people space. When they disagree with you and they don't see what you see, you give them time, and so forth. So sometimes we don't move things as fast as we would like to. And that's part of why for us, as an innovation agency, in order to be consistent and steady, we've prioritized capacity development as one of the most important pillars. For the long run, 10 years down the road, is a continuous thing. And when I say capacity development, here I'm talking about policymakers, regulators, I'm talking about the innovator, I'm talking about institutional leaders, for example, vice chancellors, who are the entrepreneurial leaders, who are shaping the thinking of hundreds of thousands of young people. So we talk about funding, yeah, we provide funding. We talk about market access, yes, we do. We talk about infrastructure, strengthening the infrastructure for innovation. Call it technology for our offices, call it labs, call it connectivity, you name it. All those things for me are important. But I've just felt 40-50% of my energy is on capacity. Because I deeply understand this thing and I know that it is independent of the political regime. It's independent of perception and attitude. It is a scientific issue, it is a discipline, and it requires consistency. So to fix it, I keep talking to people.
No, you see, the supply of high-risk capital, patient capital, high-risk capital, would you take away 5% of your pension funds and say, I let this blow up by 12%? Or unclaimed balances of 10 years ago. So, how do you find large sums of risk capital, number one? And this is again an open question, but I'm curious to know society's attitudes to failure, entrepreneurs like these that you mentioned. And if failure is a death sentence, then there is no innovation in the economy. So if your attitude to failure, your attitude to underperformance, as opposed to fraud, so these are very critical in how to shape them and how the national narrative changes. It's critical to innovation. And so is there work of that kind that happens in the system, either in Afrilabs or through this? Or?
Well, when I speak about patient capital, I like to go from the perspective of angel investors, and it's quite nice to have our partner here, President Emeritus of ABAN, in the room, because one of the things we designed in terms of that risk capital is called Catalytic Africa, right? And Catalytic Africa is an initiative designed by Afrilabs and ABAN. And what it does is that it brings out connective networks, so Afrilabs being a network of, the incubators, accelerators that have millions of entrepreneurs within the network, and ABAN that has angel investors, part of angel groups across Africa as well. And what we've done is we've created a system whereby we connect the entrepreneurs and the innovators within our network to the ABAN, to the investors within the ABAN network. And these startups are invested in at a very early stage, But then what we've done as an extra layer is we've invited development partners, who are looking to invest in the innovation ecosystem, but are not necessarily looking at the traditional way of, putting money into the ecosystem, but having the private sector vet, in the case the investors, the startups before they put in the money. So this sort of brings in the expertise of investors that understand the markets and investability of the startups as well. And then when an investment is made into the startup, there's a matching grant that goes to the startup. But it doesn't end there. There's a support system. So part of that fund as well is deployed to the innovation hubs to provide follow-on support, and follow-on reporting back as well to the platform on the progress of the startup, and that way if there are any challenges and all that, it can be tailored and, addressed.
Do you survey the ones that did do well? Do you bring people together and say that, okay, these institutions got together, they didn't do well? Would they give you feedback?
In terms of the startups? Yeah, there are different factors to that. We ran the pilot, which lasted for over 2 years, and there were, we invested in startups across various sectors, mobility, health, agriculture, education, and other sectors as well, across multiple African countries. And what else we saw that was quite interesting is that we found with the investors that invested in startups in other countries. So it wasn't just the angel, it wasn't just the investments that happened, within the countries, but cross border as well, which again, the power of networks, right? And we had innovation hubs that supported startups in multiple countries. Now, in terms of failures, there are different factors to it. On one hand, you can talk about the market not being ready, right? We've had situations where fantastic startups, fantastic ideas, but the market dynamics or the policies were quite tough, But what we do as well in spaces like that is work with the startups to see, what other markets can you scale to, and we've had situations like that, for example, whereby startups are maybe struggling in one market, we connect them to an innovation hub through our network to explore other markets, and they perform better.
This is a short session, so before I conclude, I just want to turn to Mr. Reddy, who was a civil servant and a distinguished civil servant before he became the head of the Schoolnet company. So, do you have a final comment on how you think? You've seen the world from two different sides, right? From one case, as an Indian bureaucrat, you know what life is like sitting on the other side of the table. But when you shift to this side of the table, life changes completely. So I want to ask you what your thoughts are on innovation before I ask Sandeep for a quick comment and conclude.
I think innovation, when we look at it, we need to look at maybe 3 levels. There are national level innovations across the systems. Then there are, the meso level, macro level. And each of these innovations are there under the control of the stakeholders. We can bring in innovations in a limited way and a major way. I think innovation, when we say, it's not right to equate that with a major policy change only to be brought in by the government only. I think it is all put together comes in. And also just in the context of India-Africa network, and we all been looking at what is that from India we can give. I think there are a lot of stuff that from Africa also we can take to India.
Yeah.
And we should realize the fact that 1/4 of India still the human development indicators are below the sub-Saharan standards. So that's a reality there. A lot of innovations happening. For example, there is an organization called Chanson International, which actually finances the students on the learn first and pay later, income sharing implement. We are taking them, they are very active in Africa, we are taking them to India and to finance Tibet students of India, where we as a lender. I think the innovation can come from there, and it doesn't require RBI to come in to do it. But RBI will have to play a role of allowing this, if there are any systemic kind of issues, RBI will have to come in. I think it's both ways, and India has a lot of progress, but a lot more to be done. And so is the case, I believe, in Africa as well.
I certainly believe and feel that when government and the private sector combine forces, you can move at a much faster pace, right? Mr. Reddy mentioned about blended finance, right? The previous question you asked, we have fantastic examples of Singapore, like Temasek Holdings, or the Abu Dhabi government having RDI and Mubadala. Estonia doing so great in terms of the government investing into the startup ecosystem. I think Singapore, 1% of the GDP is invested into research, innovation and development. I think that was a 2020 to 2025 plan. Estonia has $800 million invested. India has Startup India program, which is what, 10,000 crores, roughly $1.2 billion, of which I think 10% has already been deployed into 80,000 startups. So, coming back to blended finance, what this does is create confidence into the private sector that yes, if the government is backing with infrastructure, investment, and the ease of setting up, the private sector, the investment ecosystem gains a lot more confidence, into the ecosystem so that they can invest, and those initiatives or those ventures can move at an even faster pace. Right, so the government can definitely propel. Certain areas it's happening better than the others, but we cannot say that the other areas are not moving fast enough. Even that uncertainty or the gaps that we can identify. That's what entrepreneurs do: identify the gaps, somehow figure out, how to raise capital and execute. But yes, if you have that double engine of government and the private sector, the pace is definitely different.
Comment on
Just a quick one. Because I see this every other day. How quick it is to change things is something we can only wish. Because it takes a long process to do many things. You just gave an example about the experimentation and the desire to fail and the attitude about failure and so on and so forth. Changing the system is really complicated. So part of what I've tried to do, because I know that matters, the attitude matters. So desire activate mechanisms in the private sector, gets involved in piloting certain things, plugging at different levels of the education system to support the mindset change. Because otherwise, from our policy standpoint, it becomes very complex.
So that mindset change will mean frequent floor crossings. The private sector people go and work in government, the government people come and work on the private sector, and this cross-pollination takes place. Empathy doesn't grow. So I think that there is you wanted to say something.
Okay, yes, I just wanted to add to that. I really like your point about the private sector being involved, and specifically also in lobbying for these enabling policies as well, because that's something that we found as well in our space, because it's virtually impossible to do good work and innovate and scale in an environment that is not enabling. And we're really excited to see a lot of African governments actually are now embracing innovation policies, startup policies in a number of countries. We have specific sector policies like EduTech policies, for example, being developed and all of that. Last year, we carried out a study with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on AI strategies and policies, and we saw over 48% of African governments actually have either AI strategies or actual laws that have been passed around AI, and then the rest are either in the development stage or are currently building it. Now, this is possible because the private sector has actively worked hand in hand with the government in those countries, the innovation ecosystem, and everyone just basically saying, let's do this together, and speaking to the economic and social benefits of these strategies as well being implemented.
Well, on that note, we must conclude because we've run out of time. I think that any other private conversation Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Another round of applause. We are now moving into lunch. Just some instructions on lunch. You should have received a lunch voucher for lunch. If you haven't received a lunch voucher for lunch, please make your way to the front and we'll get you a voucher for lunch up front here, okay, with Emmanuel, okay? And in terms of after lunch, so the lunch is going to be up until now, and then the panels will start at 3 o'clock sharp. So the round tables will be 1 hour each, so please be prompt to the round tables. 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. So that we can come back and close for the day, and then for the dinner. And then for those of you who are attending the green energy and sustainability, as well as the EduTech round table, please make your way back to this plenary room. Green energy, sustainability, as well as EduTech. Please make your way to this room. For healthcare, first floor, and then for education skills and smart infrastructure, 2 floors down. Okay, so just check, education and smart will be back here in this room. Sorry for confusion. So, green energy, EduTech in this room. Healthcare, MedTech, 1 floor down. And